Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture, we are going to discuss the Transcontinental Railways. Now, before we begin our lecture for today, I would like to do our customary recap and just discuss, just lightly touch on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in the last lecture, we discussed Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and the robber baron universities. We did a three-part lecture series on industrialization in the Republic. We discussed how the robber barons were very unscrupulous in their business practices, very cutthroat, very ruthless, but nonetheless were key to fueling the United States' surge into great power status by uh, by utilizing business practices that allowed them to maintain monopolies in their industries, but their monopolies sort of fueled the surge, sort of providing jobs, opportunity, and created great wealth for the nation. And in doing so, and in creating their monopoly, the robber barons earned a lot of public mistrust. The public deeply mistrusted them and their monopolies, and individuals such as William Demarest Lloyd and Ida Tarbell sort of took the charge in sort of leading public anger and resentment against the robber barons, which sort of fueled the robber barons' desire to sort of repair their public relations, their public personas, by embarking on philanthropic endeavors, namely the creation of the robber baron universities. Universities such as Stanford, Duke, Vanderbilt, the University of Chicago, and of course Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon bears the names of a great steel industrialist and a great financier. Mellon was a financier. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture for today, which is the Transcontinental Railroads or railways. Now, the first transcontinental railway was planned back in the 1850s as part of the economic reorientation of the Republic to lessen the dominance of the then slave states. The slave states had a great control over the national economy. In the 1850s, cotton alone provided the United States with a favorable balance of trade. Cotton alone. Let that just sort of sink in. Now, the construction of the railway was halted by the outbreak of hostilities between the United States and the 11 rebel states. By 1865, however, work had begun in earnest on a national rail line. Between 1865 and 1869, the Central Pacific Railroad Company, moving east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific Railroad, moving west from Omaha, had begun to lay tracks. Both companies were greatly aided by the federal government in this endeavor, through direct cash payments and through land grants. Now, there were enormous difficulties that had to be faced by both rail lines, particularly the Central Pacific, who had the daunting task of creating a rail line through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. It took nearly 3 years for the workers to clear a path through the mountains. Both rail lines faced great technical, logistical challenges due to the great distances being covered. Now, completion of the rail line cut the time necessary to travel across the western states and territories from roughly 3 months to a week. The line was so successful that other transcontinental railroads soon followed, in the later 19th century, with spur lines linking the transcontinentals, creating a very impressive network of a railway system that by the end of the 20th century just crisscrossed the American landscape. Now, this was made possible because of industrialization, the massive amounts of steel being produced by companies like Carnegie Steel Company, and all of these sort of came together to allow the mountain and plains of the Western territories to be settled more rapidly, to be settled really at all. These areas had been considered too far remote to be settled before the rails were completed. Now, the rails were, of course, nothing new. In our past discussions, we covered Peter Cooper and Tom Thumb, along with the Baltimore and Ohio railroads. Railways had been increasing in prestige and commercial viability in the United States since the 1830s. Now, there were a number of factors that went into railways, and the railways climbed to being the preferred method of transportation in the early republic. Namely, it was a more convenient alternative to the horse-drawn carriage or the oxen-drawn wagon. Locomotives were vastly more powerful and capable of pulling multiple cars at once. There were a couple of prerequisites for building a successful railway. One, the trains cannot climb or go down steep gradients. Now, this necessitated the cutting through of hills and the bridging of rail lines over valleys. Curves had to be made gentle. These necessities made the cost of the initial rail lines very expensive. This meant that great sums of money had to be raised and choice real estate had to be acquired before you could even really contemplate creating a rail line. Now, the real estate was typically gained through the right of eminent domain, which is the compulsory purchase from the prior owner. All of that required intense political lobbying, which in the mid-19th century United States usually meant bribery. Now, that being said, the building of a national rail network had immense promises that could not be overlooked. Industrialization was streamlined, and a new era of personal mobility was ushered in. Also, railways gave the United States a crucial advantage during the Civil War. As noted in our lectures on the Civil War, railways gave the United States a great advantage in moving troops and materials over the Confederate States. Congress had been mired in volatile debates over creating a transcontinental railway back in the 1850s that was delayed by the increasing antagonism that led to secession and the outbreak of the United States Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, Congress had passed legislation authorizing the Union Pacific to begin building westward from the Missouri River and the Central Pacific to begin building eastward from Sacramento. The route proved to be very controversial. Now, communities were well aware that if they laid in the path of the railway, it would lead to their success, and if they were passed by it, it could lead to their ruin. One town affected by this was Denver. Denver was then a still small mountain town. It had been growing outstandingly since 1859, aided in a big part, in a major way, by the Denver Gold Rush. Now, Denver was bypassed by the railway because it butts up against the Rocky Mountains. The Union Pacific wanted to avoid the area and take advantage of the relatively easier geography located at Evans Pass in Wyoming. Now, the Union Pacific made great progress over the Great Plains, which are immense but flat. The workforce employed by the Union Pacific was mainly made up of United States Civil War veterans and recent Irish immigrants. As the railway was being laid, an immense field camp followed its progress. This camp included hundreds of sleeping cars which the workers were housed in. The camp also included dozens of blacksmiths and carpenters, in addition to supply trains that brought up all the vital necessities for the field camps. And all of this was overseen by a pair of war veterans, Dan and Jack Casement. And the Casements ran the entire camp much like a military maneuver. Now, to undertake this task, a great demand was placed in the Republic steel manufacturers. Were placed on the Republic steel manufacturers. And manufacturers like Andrew Carnegie, who we discussed in previous lectures, rose to the task. They rose to the task of manufacturing all the steel components needed to create the rail tracks, rail cars, and locomotives. Now, rail tracks are laying on wooden bars called ties. Now, there are no great forests on the Great Plains, so the wood needed for the ties had to be brought in from outside areas. Now, the need for wood for the track ties set off a boom in the forestry industry in Michigan and Wisconsin. Now, the lumber was then shipped across Lake Michigan to Chicago and then sent to the field camps. The entire economy of the Republic was in that way touched by this great national project. You have iron and ore being mined in the Great Lakes area, and then you also have the forest industry emerging in North Carolina and also in the Great Lakes area. You have all these. Let me go back. Yeah, you also had steel being manufactured in Birmingham, Alabama. So you have all these different areas east of the Mississippi coming together to help in the great national project, the great national endeavor of creating this transcontinental railroad. Now, the real technical difficulties confronted the creation of the Transcontinental Railway. And one of the big difficulties was moving a locomotive across the Missouri River. Back then, bridges had not been considered. And way back in 1859, when the first abortive transcontinental railways were being sketched out and outlined, they attempted to solve the problem. They waited until the river froze and then took a locomotive out on the ice. And there, of course, was great risk in this. They did not know if the ice would break and if the locomotive would be lost. And with the losing of the locomotive, they didn't know if any of the men involved in this endeavor will be lost as well. But there was some sanity associated with this plan. Every winter, when the Missouri River froze, it became an ice highway. That is, wagons would venture across the river, and they would do so with ease. Wagons and also people. You would simply wait until the river froze, and you would simply go on out. Now, the conditions were great for this first attempt, and this first attempt was done in January. The river was frozen, and it had froze 18 inches deep. Telegraph poles were laid on the ice. Rails were spiked, and of course the locomotives were fired up. And as soon as the locomotive approached the ice, the engineer leapt out. He leapt out of the locomotive and let it go across the ice alone. And the ice held. The ice held under the weight of the locomotive, and the locomotive made it across the river. And after it made it across the river, another engineer leapt on and ran it up the riverbank. So that was sort of the first running attempt at getting locomotives across the Missouri River. I don't know if they ever got it back across the Missouri River before the completion of the Transcontinental Rail line, but that's the very exciting account of how they got the first locomotive across the river. And with that, we'll break. We'll break there, and we'll pick back up our lecture series on the Transcontinental Railroad in part 2. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you think about this lecture.